Hello everyone present here today. I am Divyam Sachdeva, President of Robotics and Automation Society of IEEE NCU. And today here with us we have Anshu.
Hello everyone, my name is Anshu Pandey and I will be your host for today.
Hi
We are
Anshu.
back with another Hi. So we are back with another exciting webinar by IEEE Robotic and Automation Society at the NorthCap University. I extend a very warm welcome to all our attendees with us today. So today's topic will be on self-driving car. So today, to know more about self-driving car and uh, your all answers for all your queries, we have Ms. Palak Talwar, who is a senior safety engineer at Lyft and previously holding the position of functional safety engineer at Lyft. And she has completed her master's in electronic and electrical engineering from University of Michigan. I welcome you, ma'am. It's a pleasure to have you with us. I'm sure your word will definitely enlighten us all. Thank you so much for joining us today. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you. Thanks for the great introduction. Um, Hello, everyone. My name is Palak Talwar, and I work as a senior safety engineer at Lyft. I'm going to talk a little bit about my company, just a quick overview of what I do, what I like to do, and what self-driving car safety is all about. Um, just before I start, and dig deep into the presentation, just like a quick note, I'm not going to go into details of, anything which is very technical, but slightly it's going to go into technical side. But I actually wanted to give an overview of what different pillars of, self-driving car safety look like. So let's start. So just before we get into, what do we mean by, or what actually comes under self-driving car safety, right? Which is actually a very broad category. I actually wanted to just, and I'm sure that a lot of people already know what Lyft is and what does Lyft do. So just a quick, summary of what Lyft is. It's basically a ride-sharing company. A lot of people might have heard of Uber, its main competitor, which is in North America. And then Lyft is actually a ride-sharing company with the main competitor of Uber, which holds about 35% of market share. It's closed about $1 billion in rides, booking revenue in Q4 2019. This year, because of COVID, it's a little less, but right now, based on the numbers that we are looking at, we're getting back on track. Um, Lyft, apart from ride-sharing company, has its own self-driving division in Palo Alto, California, which is where I work, and a lot of competitors of Lyft for self-driving cars, and a lot of people might have heard of Waymo, which is Google's self-driving division, Tesla, Uber, and a few other well-funded startups. Before again we get into self-driving car safety, I actually just wanted to talk about self-driving technology itself, right? Like, why is self-driving technology needed? What are the key challenges when you talk about self-driving technology? Why do we need self-driving technology, right? There are a couple of things where that comes to my mind initially when I was just working on this slide. The first thing was reduce road accidents, right? Now when you think of these different sort of numbers, or you look at different numbers or data or statistics, right, based on the road accidents, according to various estimates, around 1.2 to 1.3 million people that die in road accidents every year. This is based on the US data. In India, when I was looking at 2017, which is a little old when it comes to the data, there were around 1.5 lakh road accidents related deaths, which was again based on human issue or human error, right? Because the human was distracted or was just doing something on the phone. Self-driving cars that uses intelligent transportation networks, they can significantly reduce these deaths by simulating so many different cases, which is based on so many use cases and identifying options that are the safest in a given scenario. The other thing that comes to mind is reduce pollution, right? According to an estimate by Environmental Defense Fund, cars actually release around, and this is also based on some statistics or data that I've looked online, it basically releases around 333 million tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere annually, which is about 20% of the world's total. In the US, cars and trucks, they emit about 20% of all US emissions, right? So self-driving cars that work on clean energy sources, the holy grail of transportation. Now, you can imagine a system where an electric car drives around by itself for a few hundred miles or kilometers and then goes to a charging station, fills its batteries up, all the way creating zero emissions, right? It's a huge win for our planet. Um, the other is free up real estate capacity. This one I actually like it a lot because, given the pressure of increasing populations around the world, especially in India, when you think of India, right, real estate is of the essence. If cities are built around self-driving cars, then there would be dramatically less need of parking spaces and or parking structures, which would free up capacities for city planners to, build something more useful or helpful in terms of, playgrounds, parks, low-income housing, etc. Efficiency and convenience, which I think, reading this efficiency and convenience, you can sort of think about, that billions of hours we actually waste so much of time, just driving and, in traffic, sitting in traffic. So we can actually utilize that time doing something more useful and giving the time back to the user, right? Mobility, again, I think just giving the opportunity for mobility to those who lost or, never had the ability to drive. So I think a lot of these good reasons or sort of, points comes to your mind when you talk about or when you think about why do you need self-driving technology. And this is just a couple that comes to my mind. The next thing that comes to mind is, very sort of a good lean into there, which sort of combines, safety to it. That, what are the key challenges when you talk about or when you think about self-driving technology? And a couple again that, which is actually very broad when you think about different challenges to each of these bullet points, right? Based on the current regulations, right? That based on the infrastructure that's set up right now, based on the current traffic rules and everything, right? The current federal, local, state regulations that we have in place, right? That's completely different than what we would expect for an AV, right? Autonomous vehicle. And I think that's a big gap that, we need to fill, that between, self-driving technology level and then the current regulations, like how do we fill the gap between these two? The second is the architecture. I guess, based on if you look at the software or the hardware architecture, or at the system level, any architecture, right? With these sort of additional components into the architecture, it just increases the complexity a lot, which, obviously, gives a leeway or sort of adds more safety issues, security issues, a lot of these things. So that's, I think, a very big challenge because, complexity, it's hard to achieve a specific goal and say that, we are safe enough and, we have sort of looked at all the issues and I think we are good to go. It's basically, getting some metrics, and then trying and accomplish and making sure that you're able to reach to those metrics. Safety and verification and validation, very, broad categories there. Safety in itself covers a lot of things, which is very different than what we had for traditional automotive industry versus, what we have for, AVs. When we talk about AV safety, right, we can definitely start from traditional automotive industry standards because we have a lot of safety standards in place, right, that traditional automotive companies or OEMs, manufacturers, they're already using and they have it in place. But when you talk about AVs, you can definitely start it from, those traditional automotive standards, but you definitely need to add on top of it, right, because of the increased complexity. That's one of the things, right? Verification and validation again, right, with safety and with complex architecture, if you combine everything into one bucket, right, then obviously the verification and validation of it just increases because you have to test all of it individually together based on different levels of testing that we think about, which we're going to talk about, in one of the later slides. So getting into one of the challenges, which is actually the main topic and which is what I do. And I've been with Lyft close to about 3 years. And I was with, as Anshu mentioned before, that I was with FEV before for about a couple of years where I worked with different clients. And I worked on safety as one of the expertise. Just putting together different pillars of safety, right? So these different pillars of safety is very specific to AVs. When you think of I'm going to go in detail into different pillars, but here I'm just going to give you an overview of what different pillars basically, talks about. So if you look at functional safety, right? So ISO 26262, I don't know if you have heard of this, but this is like an traditional automotive safety standard that, again, a lot of companies right now, they apply to. and they are compliant to. Um, Initially, when you think about AV safety, right? So this is basically setting up the basis for us. So you basically comply with functional safety ISO 26262 standard. And then on top of that, you add a lot of other things, which is safety of the internet functionality. It's called SOTIF. That's another standard for AV safety for different levels of autonomy, not L5. And then we have another sort of analysis or simulation in place, like security analysis, cybersecurity, comprehensive safety simulation analysis, regulatory and compliance. So combining all of this, it does not, the intent of this slide is not to say that, all of these different pillars, they capture AV safety completely. No, the intent is not that. But if someone thinks about AV safety, right, this is definitely a couple of things that you actually begin to, think, like, how do we approach AV safety, right? Like, from where do we begin? We definitely begin with, what we have right now in the market, right? Or the standards that existing companies or even AV startups are actually using right now, right? So we definitely begin with something what's already there. And then on top of that, we add different standards, which are actually, coming up these days, or people are actually currently working on different standards, right? So this is just a quick overview, and we're going to go through different pillars in detail. Picking functional safety, which is again just setting up the basis for, automotive safety, and which is what we apply to set up our basis for AV, safety as well. Now, what is functional safety? When you say functional safety, right, what does it really mean? It basically has a very specific definition, that comes from the standard, the safety standard, and it basically means that, it's the ability to detect, diagnose, and safely mitigate an automotive electrical or electronic fault, EE condition, preventing potential harm, fatal harm to people. Now, this standard, point number one, it does not talk about mechanical safety. Point number two, it does not talk about anything which is specific to thermal safety. It only talks about a little bit on the thermal safety side, but definitely not on the mechanical safety. It only talks about EE, electrical and electronic units safety. So the standard is not very exhaustive when it comes to capturing different sections of safety, right? When you talk about the whole product, but it definitely covers a lot of the failures, situations, or conditions, or scenarios that you can start to think of, when you're starting to think of building safety for a specific product. Functional safety methods, again, it's applied to both hardware and software. When you start to do your vehicle development, or when you're getting your vehicle ready for production, it's not a checkbox again in the end that, something that you can, add it as a checklist towards the end. It definitely has to start along with, what your software and hardware development process is, because eventually you are, gonna, or your architecture, the vehicle level architecture, the system architecture is going to be dependent on your safety architecture as well. So it's not a checklist, it's a full grown process that, is applied with both hardware and software development. A lot of people actually ask this question, like, why do we care about developing a safe product? When you read this question, you might think that that's a very obvious answer, right? Like, that's a very obvious question. The answer to this is very clear, right? Why do we care about it? Obviously, to ensure safety of our passengers, right? But also the other thing that actually a lot of companies here in Silicon Valley, they talk about is, the legal obligation to ensure product and manufacturer's liability. That's actually one of the things where people think about more, and that's the reason why, a lot of these startups here, they have, different teams which is specific to legal and compliance when it comes to safety. And then we have a separate team on the engineering side, which is there to build the safety process or the safety, development process along with hardware and software. So that's the reason we have a separate team, which is very specific to, legal and compliance, safety compliance, which is mainly focused on, making sure that, we are able to reach that safety level and to avoid any sort of liability that we might, touch wood not, but we might get, in the end, or if something bad happens. There is also a very interesting Toyota case study that I've added a link here at the bottom if someone is interested, because that's a very good example of, of a company where if you think of safety as a checklist, right? And because there are two things, right? One is that you're doing everything with the timeline, right? And then you're doing everything correct. If you're doing everything with the timeline and then you have that velocity and impact, and then you have that velocity, right? That you have to keep in mind that you're just going with that specific velocity, right? Making sure that you're able to do everything along with different teams, right? Then you might be able to miss a couple of things, and you might compromise some things when it comes to developing a safe product, right? Because it's a full-grown process, again, as I mentioned, right? It takes a couple of years to have that process in place. And I think that's a very good example to tell you that that's not how it should be, because there was a case, I think in 2014 maybe or 15, for Toyota, where there was a scenario of unintended acceleration, if someone's heard of it, where they basically had a liability and they paid, a lawsuit. They had a lawsuit of close to $1.2 billion or something, just because they, not either one, that they did not have, a very good safety process in place. And second, that because they didn't have that, they were not able to show that eventually in the form of a documentation or in the form of, some sort of report, safety, documentation when there was an audit. So this actually gives a very good example to tell people that, if you have to do something, let's do it right, instead of paying billions of dollars in the end, right? That you can avoid if you do everything right from the beginning. We talked about why do we care about developing a safe product, right? Now, how do we make sure that we're actually doing that, right? And this is where the safety standard that I was talking about, ISO 26262, comes in the picture, which basically sets up, a state of the art of engineering and technology that's currently available. So standards are seen as the minimum requirements to achieve state of the art. And ISO 26262 is basically, it lays out the framework to implement functional safety analysis. And we're going to talk about ISO standard a little bit, that what the standard is, about the workflow, what does the standard capture, and what do we actually do when we say that we are going to deploy or we are going to develop a safe product, right? What are the key things or artifacts, safety artifacts, in other words, that we can say we need to think about. Just a quick, comparison between ISO 26262 standard, and this is something that I've already touched base before in the previous slides, that the current definition of, traditional automotive industry, right? It's applicable for cars on road today. They follow ISO 26262 standard, which is the basis. And it's well structured with clear guidelines. When you go through the standard, it's a big standard. It has like close to 9 to 10 parts, and every part has like, very specific guidelines in terms of, conceptual phase, system level phase, design phase, hardware, software, in terms of verification, validation, in terms of the tools that you need to use while, when you build a safe product. How do you build safety critical software, hardware, specific ECU that you should look at using when you develop a safe product. So the standard captures a lot of things in there, right? Which is currently, what's applicable to cars on road today. Now, the future definition, which is, in addition to the current definition, AV safety will focus heavily on software safety and integrity, right? And so the complexity of it just increases because it adds so many additional components like sensors, perception, prediction, planning, real-time data collection analysis, as I said there, right? So obviously, starting from ISO 26262, that's basically a good start, when you think about applying safety standards to AV, autonomous vehicles. You can begin with ISO 26262 and then you can build on top of it. And how do we build on top of it again? It's what we're going to talk about in the next couple of slides. A lot of these startups, they basically, there's another thing that a lot of these startups, they are currently doing as well in the Silicon Valley. It's they get the standard, ISO 26262 standard, and because this standard is applicable to traditional automotive vehicles, right? So these companies, they can, tweak the standard in a way that's applicable to AVs. So when it comes to applying to the standard, we don't have to have like a one-on-one mapping between the guidelines that's there in the standard. We basically have to be smart enough and then to customize that standard in a way that can be applied to AVs. And then obviously we have additional challenges, which we'll talk about again in the next couple of slides. Moving on to the workflow. So this is what I actually just wanted to give, just an overview of what different phases of the safety development process or safety artifacts we basically deliver as part of the safety audit, safety assessment. when we are sort of, getting our vehicles ready to go on the public roads. Um, to begin with, right? So basically, this is a V process. We call it V cycle or V model. It basically goes from here, from the top left, all the way down and then to the right. So as you can see, right, towards the left, it only talks about the design phase. So the left side of V only talks about design phase, where you have your conceptual, sort of design in place, and then you have your requirements, specification in place. And then at the bottom, you have the implementation. On the right, it's all about testing those requirements. So it basically talks about different levels of testing that you have to do for different levels of requirements, right? Getting a little bit more into detail, when you start with the left side, right, you basically, when you think of any product that, or when you think of anything as a system, right, where you think that you'll have to apply functional safety to it, right, you think about, or you basically do an extensive or exhaustive, it's called hazard analysis and risk assessment. It basically means that, you lay out so many different specific failures that could occur on the vehicle, whether it could be unintended acceleration, it could be unintended, or probably in terms of braking, right? So it could be too hard braking, unintended acceleration, unintended steering, that you steer the vehicle too quickly or too hard. So you talk about different scenarios that could occur on the vehicle, right? And what are the causes for those scenarios? So for every scenario or every sort of malfunction that you think of, that could happen or occur on the vehicle, you basically assign a rating to that failure, like how severe that failure is, right? How controllable that failure is, and how probable it is for that failure to occur. What's the probability of that failure to occur based on different circumstances or different situations or scenarios, right? So for example, if you're driving and you're just at an intersection, you're just reaching the intersection at a stop sign or a red light, and you're basically talking of unintended acceleration at an intersection, right? Now that specific scenario, and you're driving at, I don't know, 10 miles or 15 miles an hour. So that specific scenario, the probability of that scenario occurring, it's very high, right? That can actually happen on a daily basis, right? That you're reaching an intersection or a stop sign, and then that sort of the whole condition of the scenario, right? The operating condition, we call it. And then you apply severity level to it, like how severe that failure is. Like for example, if you're reaching the stop sign, and then the unintended acceleration malfunction, you're talking about unintended acceleration malfunction, right? And if there is a vehicle coming from the other side, then you obviously assign a severity of higher level, right? That's a little severe, that could lead to some level of injury. So based on the different, based on these different environmental conditions, severity, exposure, which is again same as a probability, and also controllability, if this happens, then how controllable it is. Either you have a safety driver who's not doing anything in the vehicle, and how quickly can the safety driver take control of the vehicle, or if you have an operator or the back end, like how quickly can the system react to the situation, right? So based on that extensive risk assessment or risk analysis, right, we derive our top level safety goals. So safety goals is literally, in other words, we can sort of say that's the top level sort of safety requirements for us, like very high level safety requirements that is basically set for for the project, for the program, based on the analysis that we do. Getting into detail here, functional safety, technical safety, and then hardware and software safety, right? So you basically get into more details, and you basically keep on tracing and you're detailing that requirement down to another level. So you do it at the vehicle level, then you do it at system or component level, and then you do it at hardware and software or module level, right? Which is very specific, like a unit level. So you keep on detailing those requirements down. And then in the end, you basically have implementation specific hardware and software requirements that you work with, with the hardware and software teams to implement those requirements, which basically, has a full trace to the top level risk assessment or the safety goal, in other words. So the teams, when you work with the teams, you basically deliver these safety requirements to the teams, and then the teams implement those requirements, whether they're using, model-based environment, which is, MathWorks, MATLAB, Simulink, whatever environment they're using, it doesn't matter, or they're just basically using handwritten code like C, C++, right? So it's independent. And then on the right, it basically talks about all different levels of testing that we do to comply to these safety requirements on the left. So starting from the bottom, right, because we had these implementation specific or unit level implementation, at the bottom, you start with unit level testing, and I think that's the basic sort of approach that we take when we when we talk about different levels of testing, right? You basically start to test, your unit, and then you keep on expanding on top of it, right? So you start with unit, then you go to component, and then you go to that specific ECU level, and then you go to, sort of 2 or 3 ECUs together, and then you add, more details to it. So that's how I think you keep on moving when it comes to testing. That's the traditional approach that we follow. And the same applies here when it comes to safety requirements as well. And I think this is important because, instead of doing all the testing all at once on the vehicle, or, just doing everything all at once, when you have your integrated system in place, it might be difficult to, catch bugs. However, if you start to do it at unit level and module level and keep on adding on top of it, it'll be easier to, catch bugs and to debug it. So for different levels, again, you do unit level of testing for these specific requirements. And then you have integration testing, which is again, combining different ECUs or, based on what your system is, right? You have integration testing. And then you have vehicle level testing, which is where you run some high level safety requirements or safety goals, and then you run it on the vehicle. So you basically execute some tests on the vehicle to make sure that the vehicle is doing what it's supposed to. And then eventually, when you have all of these safety artifacts in place, you have all the requirements in place, requirements signed off, reviewed, you have the implementation, you have your test results, test reports in place. Eventually, you have a safety audit or an assessment, which is like an independent party that does within the company, or it could be outside the company as well. So that's basically a safety audit or assessment, which is like an official sign off that, okay, everything looks good. And then, it's the safety artifacts basically look good. So these were the different phases of the safety development process. Just adding a little bit to, to the process side of things as well. Right now we looked at, we talked about the content that goes into, building the safety development process. But along with the content, there is also some process that, that we need to be compliant with. So for example, just very quickly, all of these high-level risk assessment, safety goals, functional safety requirements, right? All of these requirements, they are basically traced. They have like bidirectional traceability, right? So basically, if you open any requirement here at the low level, right, software safety requirement, once you open that requirement, you can actually trace it back all the way up to, the safety goal. And I think this is important because when there is an audit, for example, or where there is a safety assessment, right? And if something, for example, bad happens, and if someone wants to look at something, right? So you can clearly trace it to, whatever it's coming from. That basically gives you a good way to justify, what you're doing is, it's the right thing. Even with implementation, right? There is some level of traceability between your implementation specific requirements here at the bottom to what you're implementing, right? So there are tools in the market that you can use that are very specific to, functional safety. They are certified tools that can be applicable, that can be applied to safety critical software or hardware that you can use to trace these requirements to your implementation to make sure that you're implementing all the requirements and then you're missing out on any requirement, basically, right? So that's the reason why you need to have like complete traceability to implementation. Also traceability between requirements and testing, as you see here. So all of these different levels of testing, they are traced to its requirements, right? This is again making sure that you're tracing, that you are testing all of your safety requirements, and then you're not missing out in any of these requirements when you're going through your verification and validation process. Moving on, I actually wanted to put this slide in here just to give a sense of, when you talk about hardware, because we talked about hardware and software safety requirements, right? Now, you might wonder, what does hardware, or what do you mean by software safety requirement? What are some of the examples, when you think of software safety requirement or when you think of hardware safety requirements? So I just wanted to put this slide in here as an example to talk about some of these scenarios or some of the requirements that actually come up when you do some sort of software safety analysis or risk assessment, which are actually it's not a requirement, but it is basically derived into a requirement based on what the statement is here. So when you talk about software safety requirements, right? So there are different things that think about when you write these requirements. Or when you do your safety assessment and when you get your safety goals, right? So there are certain things that you think about or you look at when you think of different sort of failures that can occur in the system, right? Or that could, that could lead to a failure, for example. So there are different ways. One of the questions is like, how do you detect failures like an invalid sensor data or network communication overload, for example, right? So when you think about the different failures, right, when you think about its mitigation strategies as well, like, for example, invalid sensor data, right? Like, how do you mitigate that failure? If that happens, it could happen, right? That you have, for example, if you talk about communication protocol, any communication protocol, right? It could happen that you're getting invalid communication, right? Um, then how do you mitigate that failure? Is what the requirement basically tells you, which is actually implemented in the software, right? Um, to mitigate that, you can actually do a couple of things, right? You can in order for us to detect message corruption, for example, if you're sending messages over communication protocol, it could be any network again. Then you talk about different sort of failures like message corruption, that the message can get corrupted in between, that you're sending between different ECUs. The message could be delayed, for example, right? There could be some latency factor in there, or the message, there could be like a message loss, right? Like a message drop, in other words. So basically these requirements, in other words, tells us a way, or it tells us a way to mitigate these kind of failures. Like, how do we detect message corruption? So the requirement, implementation specific requirement, is going to be very specific of what needs to be done for us to detect that failure, right? And also, once we detect that failure, right, how does the system behave to that failure? So one is detection, right, and the other is reaction. The requirements are basically the way we write these requirements. It's split between two parts, right? Detection and reaction. So one is how do you detect it, and then how do you react to it, right? So once you've detected it, how quickly you react to it. It's all defined in how quickly or how severe that failure is again, right? So all of these different requirements basically go through all these different end-to-end way of how do you mitigate it, how do you detect it, and how do you react to it, how quickly you react to it. And then also, how do you notify other software modules? Or in this case, if you have a safety driver, it's not doing anything, how do you notify the safety driver? If you don't have a safety driver, then if, for example, you have a backend operator, for example, right, then how do you notify the backend operator if there is a need to notify, right? And also to notify other software modules, right? Um, it's possible that, if there is a failure that's occurring in one of the ECUs, then that could actually trigger to something else in the other ECU, right? So how do you notify other ECUs? That's also interesting. And what other ECUs should do basically in that case? How should they react to that failure once they get notified of of other ECUs failure? And a lot of these failures actually, just going back to bullet 3, right? A lot of these failures actually, I think, um, reacting to a failure is one thing, right? But as I said before, right, within a safe time interval is very important. That how do you react to a failure so that it does not lead to a hazard, right? It's not like that you receive a failure, that you receive a notification and then you have like 1 or 2 seconds to react to it, right? Because which is actually a lot of time in some cases. So you have to be very specific in those requirements that, once you detect that failure, then you had to transition to a safe state, which could be shutting off the ECU, sending zero torque command or sending limited torque, whatever that could be, right, to the actuator, but within a safe time interval, within like, 200 or 300 milliseconds, right? Because it happens so quickly. So, which is also extremely important. And then what level of test to run to verify and validate the safety critical software, right? So it goes back to the previous slide where you talk about, different levels of testing, which is again specific to software and then hardware as well. And then again, given how complex this self-driving technology is and the architecture complexity that we talked about before, how would the two talk to each other seamlessly without unexpected breakage? So again, I think the factor of latency again comes in the picture here. So you have to be, for every ECU that you go by, and for every specific function that you talk about in that ECU, and the malfunction that function can lead to, right? You have to think about seamless transition between, or seamless sort of information exchange between different ECUs without a lot of delay. Similarly, we have some examples for hardware, right? Like what if any of the sensors fail? Now you have so many sensors in the vehicle, right? You have LiDAR, radar, and then you have camera. And all of these sensors, they basically have different role to play, right? So what if any of the sensors play, right? How do you detect if a sensor malfunctions, right? So so there is a way, there is a requirement on the hardware side again, right? You can either implement it in hardware or software, that's irrespective, but there is a requirement that again you detect when there is a sensor malfunctioning, or when the sensor sort of sends invalid data, and then you react to it, right? The same sort of approach applies here as well. And what sort of mitigation and what sort of strategy can you think about here? For example, for example, you have one sensor, you're getting some sort of information from one of the sensors, but maybe you can use another sort of sensor as a redundant way to get that information, right? Which can give you some, probably not a lot of information that you're getting from the first sensor, but maybe some safe sort of information that's good enough for you to either move to the side of the road or to transition to a safe state, basically. How will the sensor perform in different weathers? Again, right, same snow, rain, heat. A lot of these sensors, right, it's basically, I think one of the things I'm going to touch base in one of the slides later is some of the sensors, they might have some limitations, right, and technology limitations, right? So how does the sensor behave in those cases? So that's also a good sort of bucket that actually captured here. What is the information collected from any of the sensors if it's delayed, right? Which is again the same thing like the communication, right? When you're getting when you're getting a frame, like an image frame or any sort of data frame, right? If that is delayed, then how do you react to it? That is again very time critical or time sensitive, right? And again, how do we detect faults in the sensor? It's again going back to the malfunctioning behavior of the sensor. The second pillar, I'm gonna go by the second pillar, which is interesting. It talks about safety of the intended functionality. Now, functional safety just talks about malfunctioning behavior of EE systems, right? Electronic and electrical. Safety of the intended functionality, on the other hand, does not talk about malfunctioning behavior of anything, of any component, of any sort of electrical or electronic component. On the other hand, it talks about it's so consider a situation or a scenario where you have a sensor, right? And then the sensor is working fine. There is no fault in the sensor, there is no failure, there is no malfunctioning behavior, right, for that specific sensor. But you're still getting an unintended behavior, right? Why? Because it could be because of technology limitation. That, for example, you have a camera on the top of the vehicle on the roof rack, and then there is a bright sunlight, that's shining on the lens of the camera. It could happen that the camera does not function properly in that case. So it's not, we are not saying that it's a malfunctioning behavior, but what we are saying is that it's one of the technology limitations, for example, for that sensor, where the output could be unintended, right? So for EVs, I think a lot of these unintended unknown scenarios, right, it comes along with these sensor limitations, for example, or along with these design limitations that again comes with different testing, simulating different scenarios, use cases, because there is no specific standard which tells this is what you have to do to cover all unintended unknown scenarios, right? Which is again, it's very specific to our own use case. So this standard, which is called SOTIF, safety of the intended functionality, just basically gives some sort of leeway into forget about malfunctioning behavior now, because ISO standard sets up the basis for us, right? Now on top of it, when we don't have any malfunctioning behavior, but we could still get some unintended behavior, right? Then how do we reduce that unintended behavior? And the standard basically talks about this sort of graph, just to give you a sense of how different sort of boxes are laid out in here. So in short, or in brief, the standard basically talks about different. It does not say explicitly again what needs to be done, but it basically talks about these different boxes like known safe, known unsafe, and these are all the scenarios that we are talking about. Unknown safe and then unknown unsafe, right? So the goal eventually is to reduce unknown unsafe scenarios, right? Something that is not known and unknown unsafe scenarios, something for which we don't have a mitigation strategy in place, right? And a lot of these unknown unsafe scenarios, they basically you could either come from simulating simulating these scenarios, or running some tests on the vehicle, or running some tests on the proving ground. So it basically is an activity or an outcome of what sort of tests do we run to reduce that unknown, unsafe sort of category. And the last one is just talks about different sort of challenges again, which a small bucket of what adds on top of different things, which captures a couple of other things like cybersecurity. Now that we are talking about backend, and we are talking about, for example, if you talk about V2X or V2V sort of communication, vehicle to vehicle communication, then all those cybersecurity things, it becomes more sort of critical, right? Then how do we think of that, even with different sensors, right? That's extremely important. Comprehensive safety simulation analysis. That also goes back to SOTF, safety and intended functionality, right? On top of that, how do we simulate different scenarios, right, based on the use cases that we have, and then we basically define that our product is safe enough. How do we define basically that the product is safe enough? In other words, right? What sort of metrics do we set for a product, for a system to say that it's safe enough? And for that, what sort of simulation analysis do we run, right? Regulatory and compliance, again, because there is a gap between self-driving technology and the current regulations for, again, local, federal, and state. Like, how do we fill that gap, right? Because again, there is a couple of standards which are in progress, and people are actually working on it currently and thinking about different regulations, like how can we sort of modify or use that compliance requirement, for example, for an AV, because the existing compliance requirements right now, they're only applicable to to a traditional automotive car, right? So how can we apply those compliance requirements to an AV? So a couple of these, I would say, it's not clearly safety, because safety and compliance, it's a little different, but it does add a little bit in terms of when you think about safety, it does overlap a little bit. When you think about cybersecurity, for example, there is some overlap in here. So this is it, and I can open for Q&A.
Thank you, ma'am. Well, that was very insightful for all of us. Uh, thank you very much for. Thank you so much for. Thank you so much for providing us with such a detailed knowledge and share your perspective. Now, it was a really good pleasure. It was a pleasure to hear you. Now we have some questions here.
Yeah.
Like, some questions are: is it feasible to make a self-driving car at a university level?
I know that a couple of universities here, like in Toronto, for example, and even in the US, they're actually partnered with a couple of companies, and they have their own specific self-driving programs. It's more like a research group that it's focused on. So I know it is feasible. I think the only question comes back to funding, right? And I think that's where the partnership with different companies comes in the picture. So I would say it is feasible, and I know that a lot of actually universities here are actually doing that, because when you think of self-driving technology, right, it basically has a lot of research work in there, right? So a lot of universities, they focus more on the research side of things. So yeah. That's it.
Ma'am,
Yeah.
as the advancing technology, how a student can get familiar and educated about these technologies in today's time?
Um, I think these days, I think a lot of these standards that a lot of different committees, like safety committees, for example, whether it could be from IEEE, and I'm sure that we'll have something similar in India as well, right? Or it could be SCE, or it could be ASCE. Like, there are so many committees that are working on building these standards, and sort of getting familiar with those standards. I think it's a good way to start, because it's not like that you need to have 10 levels, 10 years of experience to do something. If you're interested, then I think you can easily register and get involved in building those standards along with a couple of other people who are actually part of that committee. So I mean, I can share the committees later, but I don't know if that's a way I can do that somehow here. But yeah.
Okay. Ma'am, the question is asked, will self-driving cars will change our lives?
I think to each its own perspective, because I know a lot of people they actually find it hard to trust, when it comes to self-driving cars. Um, and it's not just theoretical, and I've seen that happen here in the US that people actually just banging the cars because they don't trust the vehicles, when it comes to safety. So I think people have mixed reactions to it. They have mixed emotions. And I would say that right now, because we don't have this, commercialized yet, so it's very difficult to know whether we'll be able to achieve this because we are too far from what we have to accomplish and to commercialize this into the world, right? And especially with India's infrastructure,
Hmm.
that's a little different and kind of a little bit more challenging. But I think in terms of how it can change it, I think it will definitely change it because, one, that a lot of these infrastructure, right, parking spots and, parking structures that I see here a lot in the US and even in India, right, they can actually get freed
Right.
up. And when you get a lot of space to build something new, right, you can have the park, playground or park, or, you can build something there to use it, for something else, which is, valuable or something, right? Um, and I think even on the pollution side as well, that's another thing where I think that it can significantly help us. On the green side of benefit that we get with these self-driving cars. That if you're sort of combining and sort of carpooling with someone, and then the car can come to your door and kind of if you want to go from point A to point B, the car can pick you up and then can pick someone else up from point C, for example, and can drop you. So instead of waiting in a parking structure or parking lot, and also to reduce congestion on the road, right? Because you're sort of carpooling. So I think it can definitely help. But if the question is when we can see that change, that I don't know because I don't see that happening anytime soon.
Okay, ma'am.
So, ma'am, will self-driving car affect the way of employment for the drivers?
Um, I think because it's too far ahead, I don't know if how it will affect it. It might affect it because again, we're talking about driverless, right? So if you don't have any driver, then it might affect it. But again, it's similar to any other industry. When you think about, um, for example, AI, right, artificial intelligence, and you think about, some specific work, and if you have an AI, then you think about, okay, if this is done by the machine or the computer, then what am I supposed to do, right? But I think even then, probably 10 to 15 years down the line, even if we have, even if we don't have drivers, we might come up with something where we would need, more help, which I don't know at this point. But yeah, again, we're just talking about driverless, right? So definitely it'll affect the employment of the drivers.
So, ma'am, this question is asked by a student. Will we be needing a driver license then?
Interesting question. I don't know. You will definitely need the insurance because if there's an accident or something, then who if there's an accident or something, then you definitely need to show the license to the first responder, which could be like a police officer or someone, right? And I'm not sure if you'll need a driver license. No, I don't think so, but I could be wrong.
Ma'am, unit testing is being talked about software or hardware level.
Mm-hmm.
Ma'am, you have told about unit testing. Ma'am, the person is asking about it was in software level or hardware.
Um, let's see. So I think unit level and software level, I can pick the examples that I gave before, right? For example, if you think of a way where you have to detect for message delay or message corruption, right? So and you have a specific requirement which sort of details out, how do you mitigate that failure. So you can have different ways to implement it, right? You can have, for example, and when I talk about very specific in specific software language, right? You can have a software, you can have a counter, for example, that you can keep on incrementing until it reaches a threshold, for example, right? Um, and once it reaches a threshold for that message corruption, so how does a counter work? For example, is let's say you receive a message, you see that the message is corrupted, right? So you increment that counter. You get another message after every 10 milliseconds, right? Based on what the cycle is. You see the message is corrupted again, and then you increment the counter again. So let's say the counter reaches 3 based on how many corrupted messages you get, and then you take an action, right? So unit testing for that would be that you test that specific function, right? So you test that specific counter function, and then you test that specific reaction, or if the counter, when the counter reaches that threshold, does the software behave correctly? That sort of unit testing I was talking about before. At hardware level, um, it's a little different because, for example, you talk about you can pick any function on the hardware level as well. For example, you can pick any hardware register, for example, right? That's there on the sensor, for example, right? So the register, for example, holds some sort of failure values or something, right? So you can do unit level of testing at the hardware based on that specific function of that register, right? So there are different ways that you can define your unit testing because it's very specific to your functionality.
Ma'am, then it is a question about what will be the moral policy regarding the accidents.
Um, this is also interesting, and it actually covers, when I was talking about like how do people, it's very hard for people to trust self-driving cars at this point, right? Because of the safety aspect that comes along with it, right? And if something happens, then who do we blame, right? And I think this is one of the things that because it's still under development and it's not, commercialized yet, so we don't know what the outcome of it's going to look like. But I think just looking at an example of what we had before, like an Uber example, right, where they had an accident, and I think even there it was a lot of back and forth between whose fault was it. Was it the driver's fault because the driver was distracted, or was it the system's fault because the system did not, give notification to the driver on time? And I think eventually it was because of the system's fault. So I think in all of these cases, it's very hard to clearly say that whose fault it is, because it goes back to doing some sort of court cases, or going back to legal sort of side of things, right, where you do extensive safety audits and make sure what sort of safety audits are processed the company comply to. So
Um, Ma'am, this is a question that will the car prefer passenger safety more or the pedestrian safety?
I don't think it's more or less. I think it's for both. So when we do, high level risk analysis, when I was talking about, or showed in one of the workflow slides, when we do risk analysis, we take into account both passenger and pedestrian safety equally. So it's not more or less based on the specific scenario or a situation. The severity of it can change, but yeah, we do take everything into account, or we don't prefer anything. In other words, basically.
Ma'am, we have another question here that when we talk about self-driving cars, wouldn't it require standardization of roads, location of traffic lights and zebra crossing?
Um, Yes, so this is where that, when I was talking about that compliance sort of like regulatory requirements, right, and compliance side of things, right, because we have a lot of regulatory standards in place, which includes these traffic, related to traffic, right, traffic sort of how does the
Mm.
vehicle react, when there is a traffic light, or, all of these specific requirements, which is again specific to traffic rules or the road infrastructure, right? How does an AV react to it, right? And this is where the gap that I was talking about, that um, how do we fill the gap, and how do we customize those existing regulations to our AVs? So I think the question was that wouldn't it require standardization of road plate, localization of traffic lights and zebra crossing? Um, I don't think the infrastructure. I don't think the infrastructure of everything's going to change based on self-driving cars. But I think it's the other way around. That how do we customize the requirements for AVs basically, and not sort of change anything which is already existing.
So, ma'am, by this, we can say that if a car is being developed, a AV is being developed according to, let's say, according to the roads of USA, then that standards wouldn't work in any other country, right?
That's right, but the standard does not. Okay, so just to clarify one thing, these standards, right? These standards, they are not applicable to a specific infrastructure in other words, right? Or something that can be only applied here, right? The standard can be tweaked and can be applied to a different infrastructure, which is in India, right? For example. So the standard itself does not tell you how you do it. It just basically tells you what do you need to think about. And then how do you do it? How do you execute it? It's up to you. So so the standard is there, but how do you apply it? It's a little different, right?
Okay, ma'am.
So, ma'am, well, I guess it was a last query from our end. Oh, thank you so much, ma'am, for giving your precious time to us.
No worries. I think I
And
actually
it was a
really
really
enjoyed it.
magnificent session.
And I know that a lot of these things they actually a lot of this terminology, right? It's very specific to the safety sort of process that we use here. And if you pick one of these words or terminology, then it'll have its own meaning, attached to itself. So it's, I think, based on the time that we had, I think I can see that, a lot of people might have questions around the terminology itself because this is again, it's very specific to a standard, right? And if you're not aware of the standard, then it's difficult to understand what it means. So but yeah, I it was good, and thanks for having me here.
Thank you so much for giving
Thank
your
you so much,
precious
ma'am.
time.
All right,
It was very productive.
awesome.